Now we have all watched the movie of Odyssey and have understand the history of Troy and how a Trojan horse was basically able to get into a so-called castle and basically unveiled havoc and hell and chaos and basically led to the so-called Athens winning the war, right? And now you might be wondering, what on earth does this have to do with cybersecurity? Now, arguably, one of the most important principles in cybersecurity is zero trust. Even myself, as a cybersecurity consultant at one of the big fours, we always talk about zero trust and the principle and elements that surround the idea of zero trust. To give you back the perfect history analogy of Troy, I want you guys to imagine that the ocean is like the internet, right? Let's make an ocean. Right? On the ocean, anybody, whether it's from Athens, Greece, Italy, Turkey, not sure if that existed back then, everybody was able to access any type of resource on the internet, right? Because that was the internet, the World Wide Web, right? And so what happened was, then I want you guys to imagine that this is your horse, right? And so the horse, literally as described as a Trojan horse, imagine that the Trojan horse is you, right, as a user, okay? And so what happens was that the Trojan horse was able to get into the castle, right? The only defense perimeter it had to pass through was the main gate. The huge main metallic gate, the Trojan horse just had to bypass, and once it was in, it was in. Right? Now, traditionally speaking, that was the perimeter and the defense of cybersecurity systems. Those were defense, these were how information systems were set up. There was just a very simple, isolated perimeter, and then once you were in, once you verified yourself, you were in. Now, as we all know from the movie of Odyssey, or perhaps Troy, the issue was that once they were in, the horse dissolved. The Greeks, if I'm not mistaken, came out of the horse, started slaughtering everyone, and eventually they won the war. Now, in cybersecurity, the same thing happens in traditional cybersecurity systems. So what we have is called lateral movements, elevated rights, or in other words, unauthorized access. Now the issue is that in traditional cybersecurity systems, when you just pass the first and if not the only layer of defense, you were inside. You were inside the infrastructures, the domain servers, the Active Directories. You were able to access the file servers. You were able to literally laterally move around within the isolated systems. So what they had traditionally was so-called an inside-out approach. Inside-out approach. Everybody outside was essentially viewed as a bad guy, and anybody inside who was verified was viewed as the good guy. Okay? And as we know, based on a lot of different types of cybersecurity attacks, such as phishing, emails, stolen passwords, unauthorized credentials, as we mentioned, and all of those stuff, those were some of the issues to why traditional cybersecurity systems were outdated. And so we needed a big upgrade. Now, modern cybersecurity uses two fundamental concepts which I want you to understand. And they go hand in hand. The first is defense in depth. And the second is zero trust principle. Now, defensive depth, in summary, is basically stacking your cybersecurity infrastructure with multiple layers of defense. While zero trust basically means never trust anyone, always verify. Even if a user is able to access the first resource, that doesn't mean he has the same access to other resources, right? So, zero trust came upon, okay? And so, let's bring back the castle analogy, okay? Should have not erased it, I guess. So, okay, this was the gate. And let's draw the internet. These are just, let's say, just watchtowers, 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 watchtowers. So, the internet was this. And in the internet, we have unlimited amounts of users, right? All sorts of people on the World Wide Web, right? And let's say you, as a user, okay, you would like to go into the castle. And the first layer of defense is perhaps your firewall, right? Firewall is just like the gate of a castle. Somebody is verifying your credentials. Are you legitimate? Is your URL sender request properly? Is the header correct? Is your IP address allowed? There's all sorts of different parameters for you to verify on the firewall, which basically gives you the first proper verification, right? And so with zero trust, right, let's imagine that this is a sword, okay? This is a sword, and then you are a bad guy, and then somehow you made it into the castle. And so now you decide to go into, I don't know, let's call it a temple. You decide to go into the temple because you want to cause chaos. Now, inside the temple is essentially an object, or let's just call it a resource, okay? And so, in the temple itself, the temple has its own sets of verification. So then, even though you're inside the castle, you need to verify yourself again, right? And chances are that even if you were allowed into the perimeter, you have to re-verify, and chances are that you might be rejected, right? Because the temple, let's assume the temple has different types of credentials for you to verify for, right? Let's say you have to be a monk or father or priest, and because you're a bad guy, you successfully or not successfully, unsuccessfully verified yourself, and so you were not allowed to get into the temple, right? And so imagine that same principle across multiple buildings and resources inside the castle. Every time you attempt to move laterally, you get rejected because it has its own specific layer of verification and identification. And so essentially, what you are questioning is authorization, right? Authorization. And now you might be asking, oh my God, this concept sounds really good. But in cybersecurity, how is there a system? How is this managed? And now this is where in cybersecurity, the idea of identity and access management came into play, right? Because identity access management is essentially a system, a systematic allocation of resources to effectively manage identities and specific authorizations to different types of resources, right? Now, anyways, coming back to the idea of zero trust. The next idea of zero trust is, let's say once you verify yourself, the question is, what are the types of resources that I can access? Right? As we mentioned earlier, what are the different types of resources that I can access? Now, on top of that, of you authorizing what type of access you can have to resources, there are specific things such as JIT, just in time, where even though, let's say you are allowed to go into the temple, there is a time bound. Let's say you can only go into the temple for 5 minutes, and then afterwards your tokens expire and you need to re-authenticate and re-verify. Now that's essentially a concept in cybersecurity known as JIT, or just in time, and the idea is to provide temporary access to resources so that once you are not using the resources anymore, that you do not have access, or you're unable to re-access them again without verifying or re-authenticating. Okay? And so understand that zero trust is, from a broader picture, the understanding of least privilege. And now least privilege and zero trust are essentially different things, but they kind of overlap each other, right? Because least privilege is essentially part of, put it here, zero trust. Now the concept of least privilege is similar to what I explained before, having only specific, let's say, you only allowed specific resources, and the way in cybersecurity we can explain this is, for example, RBAC. Resource-based access control. Now, resource-based access control is basically the concept that I just explained, that you are only allocated specific resource based on your identity. Based on proving who you are, you only allowed access on very specific resources with the idea of minimum privileges. Okay? And so what I've just done is try to, as simple as possible, break down very high level complicated cybersecurity terms. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe. Otherwise, do provide some feedback. Do let me know if there are specific areas you want me to further elaborate. If you guys enjoyed the video, let me know as well. But otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video.